I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging the Wadawurrung people, traditional owners of this land that we're on tonight, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. I'd also like to give thanks to the City of Greater Geelong for hosting Geelong Design Week, and to all of you for attending here in person and virtually. Welcome to Belonging, the story of an object. This evening we're going to be discussing what belonging means in the context of an object and how it influences our experiences and interactions with that object. As you probably noticed, there's a rather unusual looking old car body sitting behind me. And that body's been brought in here because it's got a lot of elements to it and a lot of story, which I think will tie in nicely with some of the things that we're talking about over the course of the evening. How belonging influences our engagement with things that we own is the basis for our discussion tonight. For the most part, we'll be discussing the time between when the first owner of an object is finished with it and when it's finally disposed of. We'll look at this in three phases: why someone would want to own an item that belonged to someone else, what it means for an object to belong, and how our understanding of belonging influences the way that we interact with an object. Before we get into why we would choose to purchase something that belonged to somebody else, let's take a quick look at the reuse industry. According to Gumtree, Australia's second-hand economy is worth about $46 billion. More conservatively, IBISWorld puts the size of the antique goods industry, which includes shops like cash converters and charity shops like the Salvo stores, at $3.4 billion a year, and suggests that it employs over 9,500 people. Globally, as awareness for climate change and of the wastefulness of the linear consumption grows, and as access to quality second-hand goods increases, the second-hand market is consistently growing and doing so notably faster than conventional retail. Perceptions of reuse are improving too, with, according to ThreadUp, 86% of people in America open to purchasing second-hand goods now. Reuse is a critical part of the circular economy and of our move away from linearity. For years we've focused on recycling as the solution to our waste issues, but it's imperfect. In recycling, not only does it take energy to break something down into raw materials, but all the energy used to create that thing in the first place is lost. Reuse, on the other hand, is far more sustainable solution, as it wastes a lot less energy all the way through the process. From a commerce perspective, reuse also provides substantially more employment opportunities than recycling or than disposing of goods. According to iFixit, 1,000 tonnes of electronics can create 13 times more jobs in reuse than it can in recycling, and over 200 times more jobs than it can in landfill. So it brings us to want to own something that's belonged to somebody else. For many people, it's a necessity. People can't afford or access new goods, so they purchase second-hand. For others, it's individuality, the ability to step outside of cultural norms. For some, it gives access to more desirable goods than they can afford new, or others choose to do it from an environmental perspective. Finally, there are those of us who love the thrill of the chase, the treasure hunt, and the mysterious lives that previously owned things have lived. Items that once belonged to someone else are often cheaper. There are certainly cases where used goods cost the same as new or more, especially when they're restored or are of certain desirable eras, brands or styles. However, the majority of second-hand items are sold cheaper than their new alternatives. In part, this is because the majority of the industry is centred around a discount model, where price is more important than quality or accessibility. Once-loved items may be harder to find, or at times imperfect, but they give the opportunity for people to own goods that they may not have had the financial means to own otherwise. I got into previously owned goods at a very young age, and while affordability was part of the reason, the other part was that it allowed me to experience things and express myself in ways that I couldn't do with new items. When I was 12, I spent around $300 on a rusty 22-year-old dragster bicycle that was hanging from the ceiling of a local bike shop. For the same money, I could have had a Kmart quality brand new mountain bike or BMX, but the dragster was more unique, it was more exciting, more individual, and it allowed me to feel engaged with the classic car and hot rod scene that I was passionate about. At 16, I decided that after year 12 I'd travel Australia for a year, and instead of saving up and purchasing a 10 or 20-year-old high Ace or Transit, I purchased a cheap and ropey 70s Combi and spent the next 3 years attempting to patch it together into a functional camper. It was no more reliable or economical than the alternatives, but provided a unique style and experience that I sought. This car body here is the same story. I've been fascinated by hot rods and by vintage cars since I was a kid, but I could never afford the sort of vehicles that were commonly used for hot rod conversions, and I didn't really want to own something that was the same as what everyone else had. Now, when I came across this body, I was captivated by it. The lines and the details of it were beautiful, but it was actually the story of it that got me over the line to purchasing it. Seeking pre-love for individuality creates a market for imperfect items too. Things that may not be as aesthetically or functionally perfect as they were in their original form can become desirable as part of style or personality. Their imperfections and their variations from the norm become valued additions rather than detractions. There's whole industries now for making clothing look unique with faux wear. Where torn jeans at the knee were once shameful, they can now be a statement. A pre-owned leather couch with just the right wear can be more valuable than a new one. Wabi-sabi is a Japanese aesthetic based around the acceptance of transience and imperfection. Through wabi-sabi, change with time is accepted, and as new condition isn't expected indefinitely. A great example of a company built solely on celebrating wabi-sabi is Second Life Toys. They carefully mix and match pieces of well-worn toys to create one-off, joyful toys for a new generation of owner. They're also a wonderful example of yobitsugi, which I'll get to later. While some of us use items that once belonged to someone else to separate ourselves from the fashion race, others use them as a way to compete in it. They can buy or rent as new second-hand prestige items noticeably cheaper than they could ever access them new, which gives them an opportunity to build a greater perception of affluence. Evidence of the demand for this sort of reuse comes from an Australian company, the Persefair, who have reportedly grown by 500% year on year since they launched. As mentioned earlier, something that's belonged to someone else will almost always be a lot more sustainable to own than something purchased new, and that's critically important to a lot of people. In this graph, you can see how much difference there is in resource use between new and used clothing. In 2021, Earth Overshoot Day occurred on July 29th. That means that as a global society, we use nearly twice as many resources as the planet was capable of sustainably providing for us last year. Here in Australia, we did even worse. Overshooting on March 23rd meant that we used nearly 4 times as many resources as we sustainably could. Reuse, as different from repair or recycling, is critical in reducing our resource use and helping us live within our global means. One of the most exciting elements of purchasing secondhand for many people is the stories which can be embedded in the objects that they purchase. In the case of this car body, its individuality drew me in, but its story convinced me to buy. The story the seller shared with me is that the car body belonged to a vehicle built in 1905 that was used in the very first Australian reliability trial from Sydney to Melbourne. Not only did it compete, it was one of only around 20 vehicles to complete the journey. It was driven by the heir to a biscuit empire which still exists today, and was written about by Banjo Patterson. It reportedly had body modifications later, before being retired to a field, possibly for decades. Given the era of car that we're talking about, you might ask if there's any evidence that this story is true. The answer? The history of the car is a pub story, told nearly 70 years ago, and passed down 3 times by word of mouth. The only other evidence that it is the car in the story is the year of the chassis is plausibly correct. Does it matter whether it's true or whether there's any evidence? Well, the chassis that this body was found with is now part of a completely rebuilt car in a museum, and the museum's gotten cultural significance protection on that car so that it can't be exported, as it's such an important part of our national history. All of that from a 7-year-old pub story, and I'm not even sure that anyone knows what the name of the pub was. The next important question is Does the story of an item change how we use it? Does who it belonged to matter? Or does it only matter who it belongs to now? Does the perceived cultural importance of this car preclude me from modifying what I have? Does the fact that I purchased it when nobody else wanted it, after it sat untouched for decades, allow me the right to do as I wish with it? Or, since it belongs to me, is its past and rarity and potential value completely irrelevant? If you buy a second-hand notebook, you can tear out a few pages that have been used and use it for your own notes. But what if that notebook previously belonged to Robin Williams or Winston Churchill or Banjo Paterson? When we purchase something that once belonged to someone else, does it ever truly belong to us? Does it always belong to the first owner? Or do we have to consider the owner that'll follow us? Or does it belong a little bit to everyone whose hands it's passed through? Does an object ever truly belong to anyone, or are we all just custodians facilitating its journey? We often attribute emotions, characters, and animism to inanimate objects. It's part of our attachment to them, but doing so can have both positive and negative consequences depending on your culture. Filipino culture attributes spirits of previous owners to second-hand clothing and jewellery, which can be interpreted as those things becoming one with and therefore belong forever to the previous owners. It's believed that by putting on clothing or jewellery once owned by somebody else, you may inherit their luck, whether that's good or bad. By contrast, Japanese tsukumogami suggests that objects over 100 years old acquire their own kami, or spirit, which could imply, by implying they have a spirit, that they belong to themselves. The Japanese idea that an object may obtain its own spirit when it reaches 100 years old is not really dissimilar to the children's tale of the Velveteen Rabbit, a toy which becomes real through love bestowed on it by its owner, the person it belongs to. The Velveteen Rabbit story also reflects pride in wear and use, similar to wabi-sabi. Following on from those examples, when does an object become old enough that its history defines its future? Is there an age? When things are near new, we generally aren't concerned by using them, causing wear or making changes to them. But there comes a point where the age starts to impact our perceived freedom to use something for a lot of people. If we decide that an object's past must play a part in defining its future, is its original form, or perhaps the form that it was used in by the first owner of greatest importance? Perhaps when something's in our possession, it belongs to us regardless of age, and we have free will to do whatever we like to it. When it comes to this car, I'm really quite torn on the answer to this question. The story of the car, its history, is an incredibly important part of it, and I feel it's important not to lose it. But at the same time, as it wasn't desired by anybody else at the time that I purchased it, should I feel like I've got free rein to do whatever I like with it, given that I'm the reason that it still exists? I could choose to rebuild it as it was originally built, as it was raced in 1905, as Banjo Paterson sat in it. But given the only concrete knowledge of its original form is a few grainy photos and notes on the chassis and engine used, it had been near impossible to do so accurately. And due to the extent of the modifications over the years, the wear and missing parts, at best I feel that would result in a replica. So in the few grainy photos that exist of the back of the car, there's indications that the seat back originally curved as two separate seat backs, and that this boot panel actually sat flat and a touch lower. So whether the original seat was damaged in the accident in 1905 and needed to be replaced completely, or whether it was a change made by the owners later as they evolved the body for racing, it's impossible to tell. Alternatively, I could build it as it was rebuilt after its accident in 1905, when I believe the seat was replaced and lowered on the body. However, finding correct components would still be incredibly expensive and time consuming. So generally speaking, cars were open on the side as early as 1905. You had no door, no panel at all, you just stepped up and in. So this door and the panel in front of it were almost certainly added in the years after it was first built. And a little bit of evidence of that comes in the way that this particular piece of timber sits to hold the door. As that timber has been cut in a very strange angle for the seat to sit down within it, and then curved and blended to try and tie with the original body. Now, while it's possible, it seems incredibly unlikely that a combination as awkward as this joint would have been done when a car was new, and things like the overcut with the saw there would have been on a new vehicle. If you were to build this originally, those two bits of timber would have almost certainly been the one. There's another indication, another little part of the story in the history of the vehicle that shows its modifications over the years that it was used. At present, I'm considering a fourth option, a story continuation. I'm choosing to imagine that the body was found in a farmyard somewhere between 1910 and 1920, rather than the 1950s, and that the young person who found it fell in love with the body as I did, and chose to build a speedster, or go job. A lightweight, fast car for local racing, built from parts he could salvage from a scrapyard. Beyond using an object, what can we do with it while it's in our possession? Are there limitations to our ability to maintain, repair, improve or repurpose something? And if so, do those limits vary depending on the value, scarcity, cultural significance or the age of an object, or who it previously belonged to? When we buy something new, I think most of us feel that it truly belongs to us. We concern ourselves with how that thing can best meet our needs, and unless it's of very high value, we probably don't think that much about future owners. When we buy something that belongs to someone else, do we feel the same way? Some of us do. We believe that the last owner's relationship with the item ends when they choose to sell it or give it away. So it belongs to us solely, and what we do with it's entirely our choice. Others, however, feel differently. Perhaps they feel a debt of gratitude to previous owners for maintaining something so well, or to the repairers or restorers for the love they've shown it. Perhaps they feel that those it belonged to previously live on in the marks and the wear and the item. Or whatever the reason, they feel a responsibility to treat the object in a particular way or with a particular level of respect. Why is this? Except in a few rare circumstances, we're not legally bound to any form of object protection, yet some of us do feel an obligation. We purchase things to meet specific needs that we have, whether those needs are functional, aesthetic or emotional, and we use them to fulfill that need. What happens though when an object no longer fulfills the need we require it to? Should we repair it, upgrade it, replace it? That answer to that question often depends on the value of the object and the value of potential replacements for it, and the cost and availability of repair or upgrade options. Maintenance is something we should naturally seek to do on things that belong to us in order to ensure that they continue to meet our needs. It can be as simple as cleaning knives after use, or taking your car to the mechanic for a scheduled service. If an item is particularly cheap, we may choose not to maintain it at all and simply dispose of it when we no longer need it. When an item is of high value, such as a car or a house, we may choose to maintain it far more thoroughly, both to reduce our risk of needing to undertake expensive repairs or replacement, and to improve the resale value once we're done with it. While cost and perceived longevity have a clear impact on our choice to maintain, as you can see in this graph, the personal perceived value of something also comes into play a part. A car that we're proud of is far more likely to be well serviced and maintained than one we see purely as a necessity. Likewise, items may belong to us that are of such high sentimental or personal value that we're happy to have them maintained or repaired, even if the cost of doing so far outweighs their replacement value. Like maintenance, the degree of repair that we undertake on things that belong to us varies with their value, both monetary and perceived. While we may primarily repair items of high monetary or resale value, many of us are also willing to spend far more than an item's replacement value to repair things of high sentimental value. Interestingly, repair itself can have varying emotional connotations depending on the form it takes and the reason for it. Invisible repair may be fine to most of us, but visible repair can upset us if we feel the finished product is lesser than the original. If a repair is purely functional, we may feel less joy in the repaired object, as it may generate feelings of inadequacy via an implied lack of care or a lack of financial capacity for a better outcome. Whether the damage requiring repair is caused by wear and tear or by accident, and who caused the damage, may also play a part in our willingness to repair and our feelings for the object after the repair. Visible repair doesn't have to have negative connotations though. With care and with skill, visible repair can enhance an object, it can increase our bond with it, and provide an opportunity for self-expression. Kinsugi is a great example of repair that adds to the beauty of an item. In the 15th century, a Japanese shogun broke his treasured tea set, and rather than replacing it, he sent it to China for repair. It was returned to him functional, but held together with highly visible metal staples, which he felt just did not reflect his care and appreciation for the set. So he set out to find a repair method which reflected those values properly. Ceramics repair with visible rare metals, such as gold, stems from this search, and is still used in Japan today. Yobutsugi takes the celebration of repair a step further by adding clearly contrasting components to replace missing ones as part of a Kinsugi repair. While the practice is best recognised in ceramics, fixing new wheels and a seat to an old vintage bicycle so it can be ridden, or a Bluetooth amplifier into a vintage radio so it can be heard, or an electric motor into a classic car so that it can be driven, to me are all examples of the Yobutsugi practice, or at least of the values behind it. In Cuba, where for over 50 years new cars were essentially banned from being imported, car owners took great pride in mixing and matching parts from vehicles of all different eras to keep their cars on the road. In doing so, they created truly one-off vehicles which showed the owners' pride in them and enhanced their individuality too. This too, to me, reflects the values of Yobutsugi. When we think of restoration, most of us probably think of perfectly shiny, old and valuable objects suitable for museum display. Or perhaps we think of cars meticulously detailed and carefully rolled out only for special events. If we restore the aesthetics of something to the point that the items are no longer functional, and they're only suitable for display, have we missed the point though? Should we restore function or form? What if restoring function impacts form? And what should we restore to? Should we restore as built, or as the designer intended, or as it was when it belonged to somebody important? Restoration at times can remove value from objects. Imagine if a signed guitar played by Jimi Hendrix was restored by sanding off the wear that he caused from playing, wiping off his signature and refinishing it as new. It would be restored, but some of the most important story and history of it would be lost, along with a lot of its financial value. One of my favourite parts of repairing and repurposing old goods is discovering elements of history, where there were past repairs, service notes from previous technicians, scraps of older upholstery, splashes of workshop paint, a sneaky signature from a young owner, or even discoloration caused by overheating components decades ago. I enjoy the journey these discoveries take me on, and whenever possible, I like to leave them for new owners to find. 20 or 30 years ago, a previous owner of this car decided to restore it. At the time, car restoration focused on appearance more so than originality of materials. Since very little evidence existed at the time of the original car's form, the owner decided to set this body aside, and the engine that it was found with, and build his interpretation of what the car would have been in 1905. The finished car is beautiful. It now resides in a museum collection with cultural significance protection, but the chassis is nearly the only original part on it. As a result, one could argue that the entire history of the vehicle has been erased by the restoration, making it more a replica than a restoration. Today, automotive restoration culture's shifted, and a car found in this state would possibly be left as is, or restored to functional, retaining as many existing components as possible, no matter what the cost of repair was. What will restoration look like in the future, I wonder? Let's say that we decide that restoring function is more important than restoring aesthetics. The next logical question must then be, instead of returning an item to functioning as it was when it was new, How can I make it suit my needs even better than it did? Can I improve its function to contemporary standards? Improvements are common on an item when it's near new. This car body was modified to lower the seat position. The seat itself was probably swapped, its engine replaced with a newer, larger one, a passenger door added, probably many more little changes, all of which reflected the styles at the time that it was modified. Fast forward to today, however, and making changes using contemporary technology such as fitting a modern motor or seatbelts or crumple zone or wide wheels, which would make it more suitable for driving if driving down the road still its purpose, would seem to most people like really quite ridiculous things to do to it. There are people out there and companies who charge huge sums of money who'll transform an ancient car into something that functions nearly as well as a new one. But for most people, efficiency of driving isn't their primary need when purchasing a vehicle of a certain age. This change in need is perhaps why improvement and modification becomes less common with age. The needs that we want an older vehicle to fulfill are different to the ones we expect a new one to meet. An example of this shift in needs can be seen looking at computers. I grew up with computers in my life from a pretty early age. By late primary school, I knew how to open up the school's Apple IIe computers and swap and change boards around to improve operation. I watched as my father fitted additional RAM and faster processors and new drive types to our family's desktop computer to improve its function. Later in life, I made those same changes to my own laptops so that they continued to meet my needs. Once a computer reaches a certain age, however, it becomes impossible to upgrade minor components to keep them up to speed, and therefore they're no longer able to meet their original need. At this point, computers that aren't scrapped can meet needs as a museum piece, or perhaps undergo drastic change. Maybe they're emptied and become an enclosure for a games console. No one will much mind if a 20-year-old desktop computer's gutted in this way, and similarly, they won't mind old Apple iMacs that are regularly emptied and turned into stylish cat beds and objects like that. But people might be bothered if a first generation, low production Apple was having the same modifications made, especially if they weren't reversible. A car is no different. We may extend the life of a car by fitting replacement parts in the place of worn ones to keep it on the road. Countless P-platers and other drivers have found ways to add performance to their prized cars, whether by doing something as simple as fitting better tyres or as drastic as an engine swap. And likewise, they'll change them to suit their individual styles. 100 years ago, it was exactly the same. This body dates from the dawn of motoring. When it was first built, there were only a handful of car sellers in New South Wales, and the total number of cars up there was likely in the hundreds. Technology was improving rapidly, and modification was incredibly common. For cars that were raced, as this one was, it wasn't unusual for entire bodies to be swapped between races. Accident damage was also a common catalyst for improvement. This particular vehicle was believed to have been in a nasty crash at the end of 1905, which may well have led to the seat modifications that we can see. Close inspections of the body show where it's been cut after it was built to accommodate the seat being lowered. Based on period photos, it also seems like the seat itself might be a different one from the original. However, it does appear this seat was once mounted higher up on the body, so perhaps what we see here is the third or even the fourth version of the body. It's possible that that same accident the car was in led to the upgraded engine it was found with, but there's no proof whether that was done then or much later. 10 or 20 years after this car was built, as vehicles like the Model T Ford made motoring accessible, Go Jobs appeared. Go Jobs were an evolution of early racing vehicles. They were second-hand vehicles with excess weight such as unnecessary body parts removed, engines improved or replaced, and generally modifications done to go faster. They predated hot rodding as we know it today, and their values and intents flow through to vehicle modifications right now. Like computers, cars reach an age where technology has moved so far that simple or even complex upgrades will still not make that car function comparably to a new one. For many cars, this becomes the end of their life. But for the lucky ones that survive, new owners see different values in them, whether that's in uniqueness, individuality, rarity or sentimentality, or to repurpose it into something completely different. We've spoken about what it means for an object to belong to us, and how different our sense of belonging can be when it comes to previously owned objects, for a great number of reasons. Despite the environmental, financial, and individuality benefits that can be gained through purchasing something once owned by somebody else, with the exception of a house or car, many of us may never purchase something used. Why is that? For some, there are cultural or self-image barriers. For others, it's a lack of ability to tell good from bad. And for many, it's that buying new is simply so much more convenient than buying used. Changing perception and changing access will increase reuse and improve our society's sustainability, and provide more people with the opportunity to explore the stories of objects that once belonged to somebody else. I want to leave you with one final thought, as I believe it applies strongly to people's perceptions of previously owned goods and our interactions with them. Waste is only waste if we allow it to be.